Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Welcome to Nightlight, everybody. So glad you could join us tonight. This is one of my favorite shows. Once a month, Mary Joyce from Skyships Over Cashiers visits with us and shares with us some of the material from her amazing, amazing website. She is an amazing reporter and chronicler of the unusual, and I think one of the fascinating things about her site is that she has double-checked and triple-checked every story before it goes up so that you know you're not getting, garbage news at any way. She researches it, and the material she puts up is phenomenal, and she has decades of archives there that you can tie into and research material for. I have gotten lost in it myself any number of times. And there's always just one more article that I want to read. But she has graphics with everything, and it is an enjoyable website to peruse your way through, and it's updated constantly. How she does it, I don't know, because I have trouble reading a book a week. I can't imagine what she goes through to get all of the material that is put up there on this amazing, amazing website. So please, after the show, check it out. It's Skyships Over Cashiers. And it is an amazing website. So I'm welcoming Mary to the show because it's a great topic tonight. I'm really excited to get into it. So welcome, Mary.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm all right, thank you. You and I had talked about what we were going to talk about tonight, and it's going to be more like story time because after I did my book, Cherokee Little People Were Real, the Cherokee people realized that I wasn't laughing at the idea that there were little people. And so I began to get real stories from as far away as South Dakota to here in, where I live in the western part of North Carolina. And some of the stories are just kind of intriguing. One that's popping into my mind right now is a man who contacted me. He was 70 years old. He was Cherokee, and he found out about my book, and he wanted to tell me about his experience when he was back in his 20s. Now, those would be like, 40, 50-year-old memories. And he said that he and two of his buddies went bear hunting here in the mountains of western North Carolina, and there was this terrible storm that came up. And so they took refuge in a cave that they found, and they spent the whole night there. And during the night, one of his two friends woke him up and said, "Listen, be quiet and listen." And there were little people right outside the cave. And he said that they spoke in Old Cherokee. In other words, he and his friends could understand regular Cherokee, but they could only understand a few words with these little people because they were using an archaic form of Cherokee. and the next they were there all night. I suspect, he didn't say this, but I suspect that the three Cherokee men were in the cave that the little people really wanted to be in. And he said the little people stayed outside the cave all night, and when they got outside the cave the next morning, of course, they were gone, but he said there were lots of little footprints about the size of a 5 or 6-year-old. And
wow.
When I first did the book, Cherokee Little People Were Real, I was just trying to preserve information from these old-timers who had seen the caves and seen the little skeletons, and I just didn't at that point think that they were still around. Well, I no longer think that way. There may not be a whole lot of them, and if the Bigfoot can hide out in the woods and we don't see them very often, think how much easier it would be for a toddler-sized little person to escape our view or our eyesight or whatever. So that was one of the stories that came out. And then another time, there was a young Indian woman. She was in her, probably middle 20s. She never would have spoken to me except about this subject, except she and I had a mutual friend that we both trusted. So after a lot of convincing, she told me some wonderful stories. And the first one's really, really cute. Her family has like a little trailer up in a remote part of the Cherokee Reservation here in North Carolina. And they use that when they have picnics and family gatherings, so they have a place to cook and also a restroom. So the whole group or the whole family or clan was up there, and the kids, and at that time she was much younger, they were all playing hide and seek. So she went into the trailer to hide in the shower. And when she pulled back the curtain, there was a little toddler-sized man with a big grin on his face. And
oh, wow.
She described him as looking like Mowgli from the Jungle Book. And, of course, she said it scared her to death, and she ran to her daddy. But the little guy wasn't trying to scare her, and he wasn't trying to, steal food or anything like that. He saw the children having fun, and he decided he wanted to join in on it. So those are two stories that just pop on the top of my head right off the bat. So I'm absolutely convinced that there are little people.
Now, I mean, we have the little people, the Cherokee little people are basically just miniatures. They're not dwarfs, and they're
That's
not.
Correct.
So, how are these? Are they in any way connected or similar to the little people in Ireland? Are they the same stature and stuff, or do we have a different variety, I guess?
Well, the more I learn, the more I find out there is quite a bit of variety. Even here in North Carolina, there are the little people who look, pretty much like the Cherokee do, the same coloring and dark hair. But the Cherokee talked about a race of little people that had red whiskers and squinted in the sunlight, and they didn't like those. They would kill them if they saw them. So there's a totally different. Yeah, I know, and I'm not real sure why. But in my book, I have a picture of one of the medallions that shows it was ancient. It washed up during a major flood, and it has almost like a leprechaun face on each side of it. And in the book, I have that right next to one of the drawings of a leprechaun, and it looks the same. So that's a drastic difference from those that look like the Cherokee. And then up in Tennessee, met with another man who has, I think, 200 acres of land, mostly wooded, and he has little people living on his land, but they look totally different. They look like Europeans, and they wear pants that look more like lederhosen, and their coloring is like Caucasian. And so there's 3 in a very, very confined space. I mean, eastern Tennessee and North Carolina, and there's 3 varieties right off the bat. So no, there's variations just like we have the Chinese and the the American Indians and the Caucasians, and so there is variety.
I wonder, are they indigenous to certain areas, like the North Carolina and the Tennessee areas are basically, as far as climate goes, pretty mild, actually. So do they, have they been spotted or seen, further north where it's much colder, or further south where it's a lot hotter?
Well, I can answer that with some more storytelling. A couple of years ago, I was out in South Dakota and went to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation and was fortunate enough to meet a woman, probably, again, I think she was 29 when I met her. Her grandfather was a shaman. Her older brother was a shaman, and she didn't have any titles, but just talking to her, you could tell she was a very intuitive type of person. And she opened up and told me stories about little people being on their land, and I assure you that South Dakota has some pretty cold weather. And one of the first stories she told me was she and her cousins, when they were like young teenagers, maybe 12, 13, 14 years old, they took their grandmother out to the little creek or the river, and they set her up on a chair so she could fish. And then the kids went further downstream so that they could swim in the water and not bother the grandmother who was fishing. And out of the corner of her eye, she saw and heard something go plunging into the water and saw some bubbles. Didn't think much of it. They went back to check on the grandmother, and the grandmother had just caught a catfish, and the catfish was running away with the line. And so she told the kids to go catch it, go catch the catfish. And so the kids jump back in the water, and they go down, and they manage to catch this fish before it gets off the line. And as they're coming back up off the bank, there were these little tiny footprints in the same area where they had been swimming and had seen something bubble in the water. And then she followed that up with a story that happened in another time. And I don't know if it was a brother-in-law, but somebody who was related to her and his buddies were in that same stream, only further down, I believe. And they found a little cave off the side of the I'll call it a creek, and they went into it. And they found small-sized arrows, small-sized bows, a quiver, and a little drum. And they took them back to where they lived, and they showed it to their grandfather, who immediately got upset. He said, "Don't mess with their stuff." And he told them, "You need to take that back." And apparently they really did upset the little people, because she said for the next 2 days their chickens were being killed, and things like that were happening. I kind of have sympathy for the little people because they're little, and if the big people are going to come in and break into their cave and take their stuff, what are they going to do? So I guess their mischief only lasted for 2 days, but those were some of the tales I heard from this woman out in South Dakota.
Now, if you go to your Cherokee Little People, those people from your book lived in underground caves and underground tunnels. Are you kind of assuming that most little people live underground?
All the stories that I have heard have been where they retreat to caves or retreat underground. And even the earliest stories, when the Cherokee first came to North Carolina, because they originated around the Great Lakes, when they first arrived here in the mountains, they saw these little gardens, but they didn't see any people. And eventually they saw these little people come from underneath the ground, come out and get the produce from their garden and take it back down into where they live. and they called them, at that point, they called them the moon people because they came out at night.
Ah. That's fascinating because I've often felt out of the corner of my eye, I've seen little people, but now the little people I've seen are littler than these little people. They are. There's a whole other line of them. The ones I've been talking about are like toddler size. And for the first time, I'm going to be jumping into a whole new area. The article will be published by Saturday, I believe, if all goes well. And it's the story of a man who went camping with his buddies, and the whole plan was to go camp in the national forest in South Carolina, and then to get up the next morning and go fishing. Well, they're sitting around the campfire and having a good time, and the man who's telling me the story said he got tired and he went over and sat on a cooler, and his buddy came over and said, are you all right? Is everything okay? And at that very moment, he saw something move off to his left or right, it doesn't matter. And, of course, he immediately was concerned that it might be a bear or a panther or something that's wild in the woods. But it was a little man who he said was only about 12, 13, 14 inches tall that jumped up on a mound of dirt, and he described him as looking very much like a leprechaun. He said the hat wasn't the same. The hat was, not pointed. It was kind of a floppy hat with a flat top, and he didn't have a beard. He had brown hair. It was neatly cut, and let's see what else. He wore his pants tucked into his boots. He said that all of his clothing was in various shades of brown, so he said it would be easy for this little guy to camouflage into the woods. And the little guy actually spoke to them. He could not understand them. It was a different language, but he could tell by the tone that the little guy was simply greeting them or saying hello or saying, "Here I am." And the man's buddy just freaked out, and he went and rushing at the little guy. He was going to stomp him out. And the little guy jumped and ran, and then the guy who had panicked, he took a deep breath and backed up, and the little guy came back and was very angry. And he gave what most of us would know as the Italian "up yours" sign. Yes. And he was very angry. All right, a much greater length of time, this man met somebody else who actually believed his story and knew what he was talking about. This second man, he and his buddies would go camping and hunting and fishing in the same part of this forest in South Carolina, and they had made friends with this little guy, and sometimes they would give him beer. And so in hindsight, the little guy was just showing up thinking he might get some beer, was the way the story seems to have worked out. I would never have printed that story, except this guy is a professional and, has a reputation that you have to take seriously. Plus, I learned about a little mummy that was found out west. I think it's the Pedro man. I'm not sure I got it right anymore. And this little mummy is 14 inches tall, and it had been violently killed. The head had been smashed in so that the brain was totally exposed, and the back was damaged, and I don't know, the collarbone was broken. But this little mummy was examined by two credible institutions. One of them was the American Museum of Natural History, and then the results that they found were certified by Harvard University's anthropology department. So this little mummy, 14 inches tall, the results were he was about 65 years of age. That's the same size as the little guy the man told me about here in the South Carolina forest. So you put those two stories together and you go,
okay, we have to be open-minded that this might be real.
Well, the last time we were going to talk about little people, I did some research, and I found that here in Tennessee, there have been a great number of little people bodies buried in several different places, as though a war of some sort had taken place. And, people were, we're talking hundreds of little people bodies. So I tried to find where the skeletons had gone, and a lot of them were taken to one of the museums here in Tennessee, and I think when the museum moved, they took the bodies with them, but when they redid their displays and everything, the bodies were not put out anymore. So there apparently were great numbers of them. I mean, it's the same thing as with the giants. They found vast places where there was obviously a war of some sort, and there were hundreds of bodies buried of a giant nature. And then I don't know if it was at the same time frame or not. I mean, because I don't think they even carbon dated to see how old the bones were. But that there were cemeteries of these little people here. So I'm wondering if North Carolina, Tennessee may have been a place where there was a large population at one period of time. But if you're going back to the giant bones were discovered in the 1800s, and they were old then, so you've got to be going back, I don't know, 1200s, 1100s, in there someplace.
I hear you. And there's reports of, giants all over the world. And I did very, very superficial, but I did a little research about giants in the Bible quite some time ago, so I'm not going to be able to, stun you with all that I know because it's sifted into the back corners of my mind. But there were tribes, and they each had different names, and certain tribes were known to be giants. So when they would refer to the tribal name, they were actually giants, even if the word giant wasn't used. And
if anybody wants to know about giants, of course, Mary's website is the first place you go. But when you have done your thing there, on my website, there's a whole section allocated to giants and giants bone sightings, and there's a whole section of giants in the Bible.
Yeah, they're right. And people can probably find that easier than they can find it on my website, because like I told you before, we started this website in 2008, and the archives are just busting. So I can remember, the stories, but even I have to go, if I'm looking for something specific, it takes me a little time to find some of the things.
Well,
I can't tell you, go here and you'll find it, because at this moment I couldn't tell you that.
Oh, geez. Yeah, well, I know in the Bible when they talk about giants, they're talking not 6 or 8 feet, they're talking 20 or 30 feet. They're talking huge.
Consistently?
Some of them, yeah, but for the most part, they're at least 8 or 10 feet. They're
right.
definitely.
Now that I've heard. 20 feet I hadn't heard.
Yeah, there are definitely sightings or bones that have been found that are that big. So the element of giants being around, I mean, they were around. There's no doubt about it. And we have shrunk over the generations. I guess we spent thousands of years getting taller, and then hundreds of years getting shorter. Not real sure how that worked, but it was funny when the guy who's in charge of China, when his father died and he took over, there was a picture of the lineup of the army outside the palace, and you saw all these little heads just about the same size, and then suddenly there's this one that is twice as tall and then they're all the little guys again. So apparently there are still giants around. At least there was one in the Chinese army a while back.
Yeah, well, even here, which I've mentioned to you before, I feel like I really got dropped into a very interesting place when I moved to the mountains here, because I've talked to two people who were anthropology students at Western Carolina University. Both of them told me that there were two giant skeletons, like in the forensic storage area, and they each had 6 toes on each foot. And I hear that also from different sources, that the 6 toes were common among, I don't know if all the giants, but many of the giants had the 6 digits.
I think one of the things, there was a report of them in a cave in Europe someplace, and Patrick had the name of it, and I can't remember it, that in the cave they had, it was from the 1500s, and there was a report of the people from the town going into the cave and finding giant bones among other things there. And from what I've read, from what I've seen, it was common for six fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot, double rows of teeth, fair skin, and red to auburn hair. Was those were characteristics that were common among the giant folk. And I don't know if you remember, a number of years ago, I had a gal who was helping me out with the show, and her name was Debbie. And Debbie's family had genetically, most of the people born had 6 fingers, 6 toes, on each whatever, and double rows of teeth, and she did too. And mostly they had the teeth pulled and the digits taken off so that they could blend in, but and they all had the fair skin and the reddish brown hair.
Mm.
And
the reddish hair
was
certainly is very, very common. A number of years ago, I did a story, and I have a photo of a man's hand who has the 6 digits, and it's not deformed in any way. I mean, his hand, you have to glance twice to realize that there's an extra finger there. But his skin was darker, and the hair on his arms was darker. So it's not limited to real white-skinned people, just based on that. That one story.
I would imagine.
So I think your description is more common. I think that's much more common.
Well, I know that's, and the one thing that they always say, we could take the skull and put it over our own heads. It was so big. That was one of the big things they did in the 1800s. That was they would dig it up and they would say, look how big this is, and then everybody would take some of the bones, and the skeleton was gone. So. It's a shame because it. Go ahead.
Well, there's 2 books I've read, and I'm sure there's more about giants being found all over the United States, and most of those finds were in the 1800s. And in these books I read, there were unbelievable numbers of articles from newspapers from all over the country about finding these giant skeletons. Well, the sad part is that in so many cases they called in the Smithsonian, and the Smithsonian would take them, and all these skeletons that were taken by the Smithsonian representatives haven't been seen again. So they must have a basement 3 floors down into the earth where they hide this stuff. And I was at I call it my other office, Dunkin' Donuts, and I overheard a woman talking, and she was an anthropology student, and so I started talking to her, and she told me that a few years ago that those giant skeletons at the college or at the university and the little skeletons there's a little skeleton of a little person, had all been taken or sent off to the Smithsonian. And I'm going, oh my God, we will never see this stuff again. So I'm so glad I did my book, because nobody else had recorded this information. And I initially just did it as an academic paper and gave it to the museums. But I kept learning more, and I got photos, and I got location maps, and just learned a whole lot more. And so it turned into what I call a regular book.
Well, I know when there is a rumor, and I can't even tell you where I saw it, but I've seen it in a number of places. So they're either all using the same source, or it's something that's out there that the Smithsonian took a big boat, like they put trash in and stuff, and they put all of the skeletons on it, and they took it out to sea and dumped it.
I hope that's not true. I hope they have it hoarded away in, one of their storage areas. I really hope they didn't just destroy it all.
I'm there with you, but that's what I heard. So, it's kind of, you sit back and you think, and of course they're trying to preserve the the evolution of man and Darwin's theory and the whole thing, and I've lately talked to a lot of archaeologists and anthropologists, and all of them, they don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to endanger their own reputation. And so they're very adverse to backing anything that is new, unusual, or goes away from the common thoughts of the day. So
we're really not a very courageous species, because that is such a common story. They're afraid they're going to be laughed at. They're afraid that their reputation's going to be shot. They're afraid their career's going to be ended. So much incredible information has been prevented from coming out to the public because of that fear. And you go, all right, we got to have a few brave souls that are willing to, stand up and tell the truth.
You would think, but going back to the 1800s, I mean, it's just amazing. Even though they had evidence in many cases of I don't know, a flint or something predating what had been thought was the earliest form of it, all of the archaeologists got together and said, no, we can't acknowledge this. Then we have to go back and change all of our papers to go along with this. And so rather than that, they just said, it's a fraud. It's a fluke. It doesn't exist. And it's a shame. I recently did an interview with a guy on Deuteronomy scrolls that were discovered in the 1870s, and the guy that discovered them, they appeared to be real and authentic, and he was a dealer, and he sold on a regular basis tablets and scripts and all sorts of stuff to museums. So he had a great reputation. His name was Moses Shapira, and he discovered, they think, what was one of the first copies of Deuteronomy, which was the small Deuteronomy. The Bible now has like 5 chapters, but this was the beginning one. This was the first one, and he tried to sell them, and people said that they were a fraud, and so they were at the British Museum for a while, but after his death, and they say he committed suicide. I think he was murdered. But these are ancient texts that are still out there, and hopefully they will be able to find them. And they were discovered ahead of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they said, scrolls couldn't last this long, 2,000 years in this atmosphere and everything. And then of course Dead Sea Scrolls came along, and of course they could. So I had the guy on the show on Monday, and he was fascinating, talking about this mystery. And they are trying to search out and find these tablets, these pieces of papyrus, not papyrus, they're skin, that apparently are a very, very early version of Deuteronomy. So, and at the time, of course, all of the experts were saying, no, it's a fraud, no, it's a fraud. And, if they had the techniques today that they have today, they could easily have documented the age and put everything to rest. But, I mean, I understand not wanting to lose your reputation, but still in all, if, it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, and it swims like a duck, it just might be a duck.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it just might be. Well, I promised your listeners that I would tell stories, and I'm going to give you two more. The little girl, the young woman who told me about hiding in the trailer, and the little man was in the shower or behind the curtain. Her mother and her grandmother and her uncle and aunt had all seen little people too, and her aunt and uncle lived in Snowbird, North Carolina, which is more remote than the Cherokee Reservation, and there are more full-blooded Cherokee living in Snowbird than there are on the reservation, which gives you an idea of how it's a much more remote area. And her uncle was very, very much into, he spoke the language and was into the culture of the Cherokee. And when she was visiting them once, he said what he basically did was he spread out flour on the floor, and he said, wait until morning. And the next morning there were little footprints all over the floor that you could see because he'd sprinkled this flour out there. And she, that could be faked, but she said just because he, spoke the language and really was into the culture, she, believed his story. And then her mother talked about when she and her cousins would go play on, in the mountains. They had a regular trail that they would go on. And one time they went deep into the mountains, and they saw 6 little people in a circle. And the mother said that in her whole life she had only seen one girl. The rest had all been boys when they'd run into the little people. And then the grandmother said she'd seen the little people when she would play as a child too. So there we have 3 generations all reporting seeing the little people, here in the mountains.
I mean, I can understand them not wanting to be found because Lord knows what would happen to them. Their culture would be gone, whatever culture they've got. Just with people, wanting to see them and wanting to learn their language and learn their history. It's such a shame because their concept of history and their history of their people would be fascinating to get down on paper.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So,
I mean,
go ahead.
No, the other thing I would be interested in is if, because they're living in nature, do they have a religion, or are they mostly pagan and worshiping, the seasons and nature?
I can give you a little bit of an answer. The man in Tennessee, he looks like a regular white man, but he comes from the Uchi Indians. Now, the Uchi Indians were totally different than any of the other tribes anywhere around here, and they looked European. They also could speak different languages, and they often were interpreters from one tribe to another. And it gets very, very involved. But he said that, because he asked the little people these questions, he said the little people don't have a simple name for the Creator. They commonly say, and this is a quote, the one who sings the song, unquote. Or they'll use a complete sentence like, the entity that became self-aware and started singing the song that created everything. So they don't have a simple one-liner to stand for the Creator, according to what he learned from the little people on his land. And they let's say their belief is that from time to time the song stops and everything goes away, and then it starts singing again. So this would be a little bit like these different epic periods of time in human history. And you hear that expressed in different ways, but the little people were expressing it in terms of a succession of songs. And they said that they were from the first song, which means they were from the first period here on Earth. And he tried to pin them down on how many songs or how many periods there had been. And he said he didn't get straight answers. He would hear 4 and then 6. So, it's like there wasn't a consensus on that one. And I'm quoting this man again. He said, they think a lot of the religions are intolerant of each other, which is their big criticism of the Middle East. None of the religions have it right, according to the little people. At least none of them in the Middle East have it right. They say Buddhism is better than the rest. They don't buy into the whole story, but they think that the result is better than most of the other religions. They say that the person we refer to as Jesus Christ was actually a Buddhist. And let's see, when you go to check on their story, it really, well, that's him talking, but I was quoting the man who has the little people on his land.
Yeah, but, that's true. I mean, when you do go into Buddhism and pay attention to it, it makes a great deal of sense. And I've heard also that Jesus a lot of his teachings had Buddhist flavor to them. So if nothing else, he certainly...
There's very convincing stories, or, stories that should be at least considered, that he spent time in the Middle East, or not Tibet, in places where the Buddhism was. When he was kind of off the charts, because our Bible ceases talking about him between, the age of 13 and 33?
Yeah.
That's a big hunk of time.
There is a Tibetan monastery that in their records that they keep, they have the records of when Jesus visited that particular temple.
The woman who started the Montessori schools took a tour group to Tibet, and they went to the temple that you're talking about. And at one point, one of the monks came down and brought a book from their library. Their books don't look like ours. And said, here's evidence that your Jesus was here. And, they're not exactly scrolls, but their way of recording things is different.
Oh, definitely. Nicholas Roerich, I think, was the one that discovered that and wrote about it a long time ago. It just, you kind of, I think what you do and what I do is so fascinating because we get to dig into stuff that is so fascinating that doesn't hit the front pages of the newspapers, but it's fascinating to understand some of the stuff that's been going on in our culture for generations. So, I mean,
absolutely. And sometimes it feels like I'm being guided when I work on projects. The man from Tennessee with the Uchi Indian background, when I was working on the article about that, I discovered something that had just come out. There's a man named Richard Thornton who is one of the leading experts on southeastern Indians. And he had just written this while I am working on this. And he said that the Uchi Indians originally came, in their own legends, they say they came from the home of the sun across the Atlantic. And they arrived in the vicinity of Savannah, Georgia. Well, this man found out that there was a major, massive flood in Ireland and western France and western Spain in 2250 BC, a long time ago. And most of the most of the people from Ireland either drowned or were forced to leave. And some of those people left on boats and ended up in the Savannah River, and then they went up, from there. So, we hear forever that there's little people in Ireland. So maybe some of those very Caucasian-looking little people in Tennessee originated way back thousands of years ago from Ireland and came over with the big people.
Wow. Well, Richard Thornton has been on the show a couple times.
Oh, has he really? Have you? Yeah, ask about it. He's written.
I'm going
I think his
to.
book is it's People of One Fire, and in the article I'm actually quoting him about some of the things I've just mentioned.
I will check it out. That sounds fascinating.
Yeah, he says it's the oldest tribe in the Southeast and was neither ethnically or genetically American Indian.
Yeah, I mean, we have, there are variations in height and weight and everything in all cultures, but, the little people are really little. And I just, they remind me of kind of The Borrowers. Did you ever read that as a child? I'm dating myself
I can't remember if I did or not. I know the gist of the story, but I can't remember if I actually read it.
Yeah, it was little people that lived in the walls of big houses and how they, sat on thimbles and all sorts of stuff. I think that, our culture is so rich, and so much has been sort of poo-pooed and erased, and it's so sad because you need websites like yours to give us some of the richness that is going on around us. The lady who is spotting the villages in Antarctica and on the moon and on Mars. There's so much going on in this world that you don't get when you listen to the news or you read the newspapers, and yet there's so much going on that is so fascinating. And it gives history such a wonderful flavor, and you want to dig more and you want to learn more about it. And it's so sad because, frankly, in school, history is dry as a bone.
Yes, I didn't. I've only learned to appreciate history after I got out of school.
When I was very, very young, and television had just come out, there was a show on it called You Were There. And what it was they were recreating times in history, and you were there with a reporter reporting the things that were going on and talking to the people who were running around involved in whatever it is. And I remember the one I remember most especially was the assassination of Lincoln, and the other was the Hindenburg. Now there's a new series out there on the History Channel, and the name of it is I Was There. And they're doing the exact same thing. However, they are recreating it to a degree, but they have more information than has been out there before on each of the things that they're investigating, which makes it fascinating. They did the sinking of the Titanic. There was a lot of information there that hasn't been in any of the books that I've read. They've done the Hindenburg, same thing. They've done, I can't remember what are the other ones that I've seen, but every time, I sit back and think, how can they possibly have more information on this? And they do. It was really, it's an amazingly accurate depiction of what went on with more information that has been out there for a long time.
All right, so, repeat the name of the current show.
I Was There.
I Was There. Okay, sounds like something we should all check into.
Oh, gee, like with the Titanic, I knew that when they hit the berg, they stopped the ship. I did not know that the captain told them to go ahead by half speed to keep the passengers quiet, and going ahead by half speed hastened the sinking of the ship. And that was just one of the things that came out with it. It is. There were a couple. There's always been an aha moment in this. I've sat there and said, I didn't know that, but that makes such sense. And the shooting of Jesse James. Definitely saying that the James family won't let them exhume the body of Jesse James because that's not Jesse James in the grave. It's somebody else, and Jesse James lived to a ripe old age. So I just it's don't take it verbatim. Look at it and check it out. But it's a very interesting show. I was very, I of course I remembered the original.
Well, it sounds like I hope it's on at an hour when I can see it. So that's good.
Pretty sure it is. It's not on late at night. But the little people, I still am fascinated with them. I think there's so much more to learn about them and their culture, and there has to be more information out there about them because it's a race of people that were here, in the United States, for Pete's sakes, and there's nothing written about them in the books, and there should be. Just the same with the giants, but the little people, especially since they're still there, and it's like Bigfoot. You see all of the stuff about Bigfoot and hunting Bigfoot and everything, and just to throw an ad in for your book on Bigfoot, Beyond the Bigfoot Steps, Beyond the Steps.
Bigfoot Beyond the Footprints.
Beyond the Footprints. It is the sweetest book on Bigfoot I've ever read. I cried. It was so sweet, and it gives you another perspective of Bigfoots, and I think it's a precious book. It's a book that I recommend to everybody.
Thank you. I had promised Little People Stories. I'm going to tell you one more before we run out of time.
Okay.
And this was the man in Tennessee who has the 200 acres. More than half of it is wooded land, and it's really hilly, overlooking a river. And the other part is pasture land. Well, when I went there, he ended up taking me up to the top of this very large hill in his truck because it was rather steep, and, it was just easier to get up there that way. And up at the top, there was one of those kind of trees that you would like to see in a painting or a photograph. And then you could see where there was a circle in the grass that had been like, I don't know, like almost like a path, but not quite that intense. And he said when there's fog, the little people will go up there and sing and dance in the fog. Now, the funny part of this is he hired some people from another country. He never told me where they were from. I'm guessing they were probably from Mexico, but their culture was different. And he hired them to put in new fencing in the pasture area. And all of a sudden, they all start running back to their car. They disappeared. They never came back for their money. He didn't understand what the problem was. And he ran into them later, I guess, in town, and he asked them about it. And they, I think in broken English, asked him, if he heard this singing in the fog, because they had heard it. And then that spooked him out, because then they thought he was some kind of a, what do you call a male witch, some kind of a wizard or a spooky man. So that just scared him more. But they had actually heard these little people singing in the fog when they went there to put in the fencing, and it scared them quite severely. They never came back. They never got paid. So if you don't even come for your money, you're scared.
Well, knowing you, I'm surprised you haven't tried to do a camera or something to observe them, because you were so great with the Bigfoot stuff. It seems that this is something that would be right up your alley to chase down.
The only time that we've ever gotten any kind of an image of a little person was a couple that are friends of mine that live on, just a couple ridges to the west of me. They live at the top of the ridge. It's a single-lane gravel road to get up there. And they have a game camera set up by the driveway into their house or home. And it picked up, I guess an animal had triggered it that got right in front of the camera, but off in the background you can see this little figure. And the couple debated between themselves about whether it was a spirit or whether it was, something real. It was in August. It looked like the backside of somebody with straight dark hair, and either nude or you couldn't tell if there were breeches on it or not. And the couple decided to figure out how tall this was, and went out and measured it by a tree. And this is after the fact, and it was like in that 3.5 inch height, or 3 foot, 3.5 foot height, which is what you hear the most often with the little people. But anyhow, I took the photos when they finally decided to share them, and I turned up the intensity on the computer. And when you do that, anything that is alive will go into a magenta color. If it's a ghost or a spirit, it will stay white or gray. So I got what are known as legitimate ghost photos, and I did the same thing. And one of those photos showed a ghost playing on the floor with a real live child. When I turned up the contrast, the child turned magenta and the ghost didn't. Well, this little figure in the woods went to magenta, so it was not a ghost or a spirit. It was something quite alive. But that was 17 years after I first learned about little people. So they're not easy ones to ever get an image of.
Well, and I can understand why they wouldn't want to be found or identified. I mean, that you give away your privacy, you give away your life if you're that unusual. But I would have. If I was remote enough, I would be leaving out treats and stuff like that to make friends. I mean,
well,
I know
the old time Indians do that, and I've heard several times that if they forget to put the food out, they will hear pebbles being thrown on the roof, sort of like a reminder that, hey, where's our treat?
How cool is that? No, I know. I had help in my garden when I was in Connecticut. So, and I would walk out at dawn or at dusk, and I would, look at plants, and I would say, this one needs some help, and and because I actually had built the garden on a gravel pit, so that there was no reason in the world why I had the kind of garden I had. I had to have help. Mm-hmm. And it was amazing, a day or so later, plants that had been sagging were perked up and very happy, and so I believe in them. And the fact that there are some graveyards here in Tennessee, I really, when I get a chance, and now that it's springtime, it's more likely that I'll be able to get out and get around a lot more. I'm going to go hunting them down. I really want to. I want to find some of these grave sites and see if I get any feeling for something other than what normally you would see around, property like that. It should be interesting.
It should be. It should be.
I will keep you posted. I just noticed the time. Your website is Skyships Over Cashiers, and everybody should check it out. It's a fabulous website. It will educate you for decades. And because Mary keeps adding to it, there is no end.
So, anyhow, cashiers sounds funny, but it's spelled just like a cashier at the grocery store. As you already know, we named it that because the whole website started because we were seeing so many UFOs over this mountaintop town of Cashiers. If I'd known how many directions this website was going to go in, I think I would have picked a different name, but that's how it got started.
Well, it's not all about UFOs. You cover every topic imaginable, and I thank you so much for sharing your time with us again, and I look forward to next month.
All righty. You take care.
You too. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye now. And everybody, thank you for joining in. This will be up on YouTube, so please check it out. If you like what you see, please sign up and subscribe to the YouTube channel. And we will be here again tomorrow night with Cindy Jordan, so do join us then too as well. Good night, everybody.